Young Americans were still fighting and dying in Europe and the Pacific, and a few young people at Baylor decided the world could use some good news. They had no special skills, no training, just a desire, as one put it, to be usable for God's purposes. I'll spend the next few days telling the story of the youth revival movement, but it will be a brief summary at best. If you want to learn more, I urge you to find a copy of Riding the Wind of God, a personal history of the youth revival movement by Bruce McKeever, the late pastor of Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas, who as a Baylor student was right at the heart of those first revivals. It's an important story for three reasons. One, it's a vital part of our history as Texas Baptists. Two, it's a significant part of Baylor's identity as a Baptist university, a Baptist identity that Baylor is at risk of losing. Three, it's a powerful reminder that God stands ready to use us to accomplish more than we can imagine, if only we ask Him and trust Him. The youth revival movement is a story of students regularly meeting for prayer, often till 2 or 3 in the morning. I hear from people who are discouraged. They say that getting people interested in Baptist history and Baptist principles is a lost cause these days. People aren't interested in denominations anymore. People don't care what happened 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago. Yet we at Texas Baptist Committed firmly believe that our Baptist identity is worth preserving, and that knowing Baptist history and staying true to Baptist principles are integral to preserving that Baptist identity. The story of those Baylor students 66 years ago reminds us that if God has put something on our hearts, then He stands ready to work through us to get it done. Movements don't begin as movements. They start out as thoughts, inspirations, and dreams. Then they're translated into plans and happenings. Those that catch fire become movements. It all began at a retreat held for Baylor students in 1944, just before the fall term. In Riding the Wind, a personal history of the youth revival movement, Bruce McKeever writes that these Baylor retreats typically involved about 25 to 30 campus leaders and administrators meeting to finalize activities for the coming year. But 1944 was different. In light of the war and the sacrifice at home and abroad, young people, he writes, were pondering questions such as how God could take the debris and wreckage around us and hammer out His purpose. And was there something we could do to help build a better world? Those questions, he writes, and the vacuum in which they were asked, are why 400 students showed up for this Baylor preschool retreat. We were just looking for something that would bind us together in a cause larger than ourselves. The students themselves did most of the talking, not the administrators, nor the faculty, nor guest speakers. There was a sense in which it was our special moment in history. It was a matter of divine urgency. Bruce McKeever had spent that summer preaching youth revivals in North Carolina with his friend Ralph Langley, whom he had known since they were students together at Mars Hill Junior College. Ralph had already completed his first year at Baylor and been elected president of the Baptist Student Union. Following the first worship service at that Baylor preschool retreat, Ralph asked Bruce to stick around for a brief campfire service. A few of us, he said, are going to linger and talk about something special that we hope will happen on our campus and in our city. That something special was a rally for the city of Waco, sponsored by Baylor students. Yesterday, we left a few Baylor students gathered around a campfire at a retreat just before the fall term in 1944. In Riding the Wind, a personal history of the youth revival movement, Bruce McKeever writes it was nearly midnight when the little group finished praying. Words were no longer needed. God knew our thoughts and our dreams, and He spoke to us that night as He had spoken to Elijah, through a gentle whisper or through the sound of silence. Then the retreat was over and students returned to campus. McKeever continues, quietly small groups gathered to pray for spiritual awakening. We had a feeling that a movement bigger than life was in its formative stages and had captured our hearts and minds. We were not instigators, we were mere spectators. Throughout these students' story, there is that sense. McKeever quotes a missionary to China from a century earlier, Hudson Taylor, as identifying 3 levels of praying. From, "O God, let me do your work," to, "O God, let me help you do your work," to, "O God, do your work through me." These Baylor students, he writes, moved through these 3 levels, ultimately realizing that their dream was God's plan, and that any hope of realizing that dream rested on God doing His work through them. Thus prayer, dependence on God, and trust in Him to work through them became the key. Bruce McKeever, who had only recently arrived at Baylor from North Carolina with $90 to his name, was appointed to raise funds for the revival. From that point on, planning for the revival began to take off. On Friday, I mentioned that Bruce McKeever had been given responsibility for raising funds for the Baylor Students' Waco revival. As he writes in Riding the Wind of God, a personal history of the youth revival movement, he began by visiting the owner of a local business. Bruce walked out with a check for $50. Soon, students were walking up to him on campus, handing him $1 here, $5 there. One offered him the money from the sale of a haystack on her parents' farm. Ultimately, he raised $1,100 before the opening service in April 1945. A vacant lot and a tent were secured for the venue. The dream for the revival had originated with M.D. Oates and Reiji Hoshizaki, an American-born student of Japanese heritage whose family had been ordered to an internment camp in California during the war. Oates and Hoshizaki were named general chairman of the revival effort. They chose Waco Youth for Christ as the theme of the revival and appointed Ralph Langley to oversee publicity. The Baylor Lariat and Waco News Tribune carried articles daily about planning for the revival. Bo Baker was named music director. Students from 5 Waco schools were enlisted for a 30-piece orchestra and a 200-voice choir. McKeever adds, scores were involved in prayer meetings, cleaning the lot, setting up and dusting chairs, going door to door to 2,000 homes in Waco, personally inviting people to attend, and organizing a 20-block march from the campus to the site on opening night. For 6 nights in April 1945, the people of Waco came together and experienced the Spirit of God as He moved among them while Baylor students prayed, preached, sang, and testified. Bruce McKeever tells the story in Riding the Wind of God, a personal history of the youth revival movement. It began on Monday night as Angel Martinez preached a sermon with the provocative title, Up Jumped the Devil. Tuesday was Bo Baker with no draftees in the Army of God. Wednesday, Reiji Hoshizaki with Going My Way. Thursday, Lee Ray Fowler with What's in a Kiss. M.D. Oates on Friday with Blood Plasma. And Ralph Langley closed the meeting on Saturday night with Don't Die on 3rd. The Waco News Tribune carried articles about the nightly services, including the story of Wednesday's preacher, Reiji Hoshizaki, and his plan to go to Japan as a missionary after the war ended, whenever that would come. It also told of the insults, heckling, and even threats he endured because of attitudes toward his Japanese heritage, and the grace he showed in refusing to respond to, complain about, or even mention the indignities he was forced to endure. Bruce McKeever writes, the attendance at the services soared nightly above the 3,000 mark, beyond the wildest imaginations of those in charge of planning and promoting the event. There were 281 public commitments to Christ and to Christian ministries. These decisions, he continues, were made without lengthy invitations or dramatic begging and pleading. The students came, They sang and shared their personal experiences. Someone preached for 20 to 25 minutes. We sang a hymn or chorus. And then we stood back and watched God work in the lives of people. At times it was as though we were spectators caught up in a movement we could never have planned and did not understand. That student-led revival in Waco in April 1945 was just the beginning. In writing The Wind of God, Bruce McKeever writes that a second Waco revival a year later, again planned, prayed over, and led by Baylor students, drew nightly crowds of around 4,000, with over 500 making public commitments during the week. Students at other Texas Baptist colleges soon joined the movement. In the months that followed, these young people from Baylor, Howard Payne, and other Texas Baptist schools preached to thousands more in Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, Birmingham, Atlanta, Memphis, and Honolulu. McKeever dedicated his book to W.F. Howard, who, as director of Baptist student work in Texas, had early on encouraged those Baylor students, shown his trust in them, and given them his support. Before long, Dr. Howard was sending scores of student teams to lead revivals across Texas every summer. This was a movement of God, and it's impossible to overstate its impact. Listen to the words of Bruce McKeever. How do you explain the youth revival movement? That question has been asked for 60 years. Is there any human explanation for students digging deep into empty pockets and paying for all expenses before the revival services began? How do you account for 19-year-old kids preaching before thousands of people in cities across the nation? How can one explain thousands who moved into vocational Christian ministry as a result of this movement? Missionaries, pastors, musicians, professors, denominational leaders, and laypersons point to the youth revivals as the turning point in their lives. Then McKeever concludes, there is no explanation apart from prayer. Those of us involved in planning the revivals were in situations over our heads. We prayed not out of piety, but out of need. What I've given you this past week is but a few quick snapshots of the youth revival movement. If you want the bigger picture, there's no better place to start than Bruce McKeever's book.